All right, so I'm here with Dr. Katie Turner. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So I spend way too much time on Twitter, and a few weeks ago I saw you post this tweet thread about why bishops' hats look the way that they do. The mitre, I believe, is the technical term, right?
Yeah, the Mitre. Yeah.
So I'd like let's start broadly about what your research is that would bring you to write a Twitter thread about why a hat looks the way it does, and then get into the tweet thread itself. So what do you research?
So I research the material culture of the Second Temple New Testament period, and my PhD was interested in representations of that. So I looked really specifically at Christian drama, from the medieval period and then the modern world. So in the modern world, looking more at film, and wanted to know, where do these costuming ideas come from? Because a really cursory overview of the material culture that we have evidence for the Second Temple New Testament period is that Jews looked Greco-Roman. We actually have an enormous amount of evidence for that. So it's pretty conclusive that there was nothing really different or unique. There was no identifier in their physical appearance and their dress appearance that would have made any other member of the Greco-Roman world go, oh, that's a Jewish person. So that kind of idea is a fallacy, and it comes to us much later. And so I wanted to know, where do these ideas come from that we're seeing in representations? Why do we have them? What are they communicating to us? What's like the whole development process of that? So yeah. So it was in trying to reconstruct aspects of Caiaphas's costume that I got to the mitre.
That's absolutely fascinating because you're totally right. When I think about, the Passion of the Christ, Monty Python's Life of Brian, like a lot of these movies that take place, a lot of these Jesus movies, basically,
Mm-hmm.
the Jews of Jerusalem and particularly the Pharisees are portrayed in like, they're wearing costumes, and the costumes are usually
Yep.
identifiable, like, oh, those are the Pharisees. But
Yep.
you're totally right that we don't have a ton of evidence. I mean, I guess that we do, like that to show that they were dressed like Greco-Romans.
We do. So the Judean desert preserves textiles really, really well. So we actually have more preserved textile from Jewish communities in around what we would now see as like the historic boundaries of the land of Israel. So not modern nation state of Israel, than we do from anywhere else in the Greco-Roman world. So we have a wealth of evidence. We have sometimes, I mean, a few items are near complete in their garments, and you could look at the garment and then look at images that Roman people were painting themselves in, and you say, okay, this clothing is the same.
That's so fascinating. And a lot of my research focuses on Egypt, which similarly preserves entire
Yeah,
outfits, shoes.
yeah.
You can see what their shoes and sandals look like. What's that like for you to look at, a 2,000-year-old article of clothing? Because when I see something in like an Egyptian museum, like, oh wow, there's a Coptic Christian's shoe. I just kind of feel like this almost
It's
sense of awe.
incredibly cool.
Yeah.
It's incredibly cool. I mean, sometimes you look at things and you're like, I could make that. Like there are from Roman Egypt, there are a couple preserved knit socks, and they're just like knit sock. Like if you wanted to knit a sock, it's gonna look really similar. And in other cases, you can actually see migration through the Roman Empire. So there is a textile that was found at Masada that came from Britain. Um, and so we're looking at something produced in, I think it's the second century textile, but please don't quote me on that. That definitely came from Roman Britain, traveled through the empire, and somehow ended up deposited in Masada. So that's really cool. It looks completely different than the textiles that were manufactured there, in the Eastern Mediterranean region. So you were seeing cultural and geographic difference in garment manufacture. Yeah, I like it. I think it's really fun. I thought that, I mean, when I went into this topic, I thought we just didn't know, which is why our representation looks like it does, because we had nothing to base it on. And then it turns out, oh, we do. And everyone's just ignoring like all this evidence. So, yeah.
Yeah. So for me, I also study antiquity. Most, I guess, a few hundred years after you, and more late antiquity, fourth, fifth, sixth centuries. But what makes me so fascinated about antiquity is when I see things that are so daily life that
Mm,
reminds me, oh, these are people. Because when you look
yep.
at the like really impressive structures, the Parthenon or the Pantheon is like, or the Colosseum, like these huge structures. But then you see like a pair of knit socks, and you're like, oh, these are just people, and they just put on their
Yeah.
socks and their shoes, and they went about their days. And it's the same. Some of the most impressive, the sites that I enjoy the most, archaeological sites, are ones where you can kind of get a sense what it was like to live there. And you're just like walking down the street, and you're like, oh, there's someone's house, and here the
Hmm.
road is paved, and you can still see the ruts from the carts and the roads, just the imminence where you can just kind of see the daily life. That's what excites me
Yeah.
most.
I really like toys also. Like I don't
Hmm.
study toys from antiquity, but whenever I come across items and you can just tell like someone put together a little doll and sometimes they actually have movable arms and legs and you just think like there was a kid here once just playing with their toy. Yeah, I love that stuff. I love things that connect us through time.
Yeah, or the board games that are carved on the seats of stadiums. Like, oh, somebody was just
Yes.
really bored here and decided to play tic-tac-toe, and
Yeah.
here it is. That's so cool. So let's fast forward a few hundred years
Hmm.
to the development of the Catholic mitre. So I think many people watching or listening right now might know what a bishop's hat headgear looks like, but could you maybe
Hmm.
describe, paint a picture for us that are just listening to the audio of what like a
Yeah.
modern the
So
modern headgear looks like?
the modern mitre is worn by the Pope and also bishops, but it's not to be confused with the Pope has another headdress that's like the papal crown, and it's different than the mitre. Um, so the mitre, if you're looking at it front on, it's basically like a big triangular hat. But if you look at it from the side, you realize that that triangle swoops down towards the top of the head and then swoops up again to make a triangle from the back side. Um, so some people have said it's like a fish's mouth. That if you look at like a fish popping its head out of the water with the mouth open, that's the kind of shape that you get. And so it has been connected. Some people connect it to fish because you also have a link with Christianity and Christ and the fish shape. But it doesn't come, that's not where we get the shape of the mitre from. It's not from a fish.
And there is some anti-Catholic misinformation floating around online that connects the mitre's fish shape to the Philistine god Dagon.
Mm-hmm.
There's also, you can see like anti-Catholic Protestant cartoons from like the 1600s or 1700s where they turn the hat into like a alligator or crocodile mouth. I don't know if you've seen
Yeah.
that. So there is misinformation floating around about why it looks the way that it looks, but why does it look that way? Let's dial it back a few hundred years.
Yeah. So it's actually kind of hard to pinpoint exactly where the mitre came from and why. Most of the early developmental information that I have, I got from Ruth Mellencamp, who was exploring the horned Moses in Christian art and wanted to understand where that motif comes from and what it means and what it communicates. And through exploring Moses with horns, was led into an exploration of the mitre. And you can also get a bit of developmental information from the Catholic Encyclopedia, but there isn't a lot out there. People don't really, there isn't a lot that studies church vestments at all. Like it's just an understudied topic. So if anyone is looking for something to study, we need more research on that. But it's hard to pinpoint. A lot of what makes up church vestments actually has an origin point in late antiquity, so you can map it onto aspects of actual garments. And the mitre just doesn't do that. So Ruth Mellencamp, as best as she can reckon, says it starts somewhere around the 8th or ninth century. And at that point, the bishop is wearing just a domed hat, some sort of rounded cap. And then that rounded cap grows a bit into more of a peaked shape by the 9th, 10th century. And then it starts to become depressed in the middle. So what you end up with is like two soft mounds, a little bit like Mickey Mouse ears, if you're trying to picture it without seeing an image. And the two soft mounds are like a lot of material kind of bunched up, and then it's all held together with a band that goes from the front of your head up over the top to the back of the head to kind of hold that shape in place. And by the 11th, early 12th century, those two mounds have been shaped into horns, and they've been stiffened in the inner lining with stiff fabric so that it keeps that shape. So we have the form of the mitre that you see on bishops today, but at this time it's sitting laterally on the face. So each horn is equal in size, and they're coming up off the head over your temples. So, or like over your ears in that position. And by the middle of the 12th century, it's rotated 90 degrees on the head so that you have one horn coming from the front, another from behind. And then over time, each horn grew bigger. If you look at the Metropolitan Museum of Art has a really good collection of mitres from the 17th century, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, and you can see some really big ones. And then they kind of get smaller again, but the shape doesn't change, its size and decoration. So really, by the time you get to like the middle of the 12th century, the mitre that we have today is set effectively.
And I love the nature of our sources. So one of the artifacts that you use as an example is a chess piece from the 12th
Yeah.
century, the bishop from the 12th century chess piece. Like, so of course that would make sense. Like they were modeling this game piece after what a bishop looks like at that time.
Yeah, and a lot of bishop pieces today still look like, if it's a person, they'll be wearing the bishop's mitre. Sometimes the chess piece just is a mitre in some sort of abstracted way. So you're still having that connection with the bishop. But yeah, I love that chess piece. It's carved into a piece of, I think it's marble. And so it's like from the back, it just kind of looks like a little piece of marble. And then from the front, you can see the bishop sitting inside, like in this little carved alcove. And he's wearing the soft form, so the two mounds with a decorative strap around the middle. So you can see that form on his head.
And for anyone that can look up this piece, it's really quite pronounced. You can see the band like creating the two soft mounds, the Mickey Mouse ears, as it were.
Yeah.
And the other sources, like manuscript paintings. I'm scrolling through your tweet thread. What other data do you use
we
here?
see it in a lot of different images. A lot of manuscript imagery, either like marginalia images or like a full page folio. A lot of sigils, so that would be like a seal of an important person, like bishop or an archbishop, where someone will have depicted them, and they will depict them in their full vestments, because that indicates their position, that tells you who they are. So that's really important. So we get things that are contemporaneous to the mitre, and then we also have images that show, like, by the time the mitre has changed, you can still find pictures of bishops from the past, and they'll be wearing the older form. So you have both representations. You have contemporaneous ones, and then you have like later.
Yeah. So there was this awareness that the headgear used to look different.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you've used this term horns several times, and then you mentioned Moses and horns. I think many of the audience might be very confused by this terminology.
Yeah, like, where are we getting this horn
Where
from?
are we getting this horn? Yeah, give us some backstory here. Why horns?
So I'm terrible at details off the top of my head, so I'm going with things that are written down. So we get this mostly from Moses, and that's important, because in the description of Moses, when he has been up on Mount Sinai and he's been talking to God, and he's been spending a lot of time in God's presence. And one thing that we know from, it's sort of a repeated motif in the Bible, is that being in God's presence is like difficult for humans. So God will often be disguised, say in a burning bush, something to kind of make that communing easier. But in this case, Moses is like spending a lot of time in God's presence. And then when he emerges from that, he emerges looking radiant. And the Hebrew has the word Quran. And when Jerome was translating the Hebrew into Latin, he moved. Sorry, I want to make sure I get it
We can
like
totally we can pause.
correct.
Yeah, we can pause and restart if you want, if you want.
So it's in Exodus 34:29 that we have Quran describing Moses' appearance. And in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew text, that is translated as doxa, which means glorify, honor, magnify. And then when Jerome comes and he's translating the text into Latin, he translates Quran as cornua, which means horned, but it's horned in the sense of glory or honor, which is this much older sense of the word horned. And the word Quran in Hebrew also is like a ram's horn, like elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible. So this link between this idea of glory or honor and a sense of horns is not just like, it's not a mistake that Jerome made. It's very intentional, purposeful, and he's probably right. This is the right sort of translation to make. Yeah, so Jerome himself explains, because he provides commentary for Exodus, and he says that Moses' face had been glorified, or as it says in the Hebrew, horned. So he's telling you he understands cornua to have this meaning of glorified or honored. But it ends up being translated in art as depicting Moses with literal horns. I mean, it's understood positively because I think early artists got this whole connection. But that is where we get the link with the mitre. So the idea of the mitre having horns is linked to Moses having horns and the concept of the horns signifying glory or honor from God. And so the mitre itself is referred to as cornua, the Latin for horn. And sorry, go ahead.
Well, so horned is like a metaphor, like when you say your heart's sick or your heart aches, you're using this in a very kind of metaphorical way. So if you say horned, it's not like literal horns, it's like this metaphor of some sort of meaning honored, even though
it's a metaphorical horned. I think people are probably most familiar with the idea of Moses with horns from Michelangelo's statue of Moses, where he has these two little horns, but it is a really common motif in Christian art, and you can find it in manuscript illumination and in paintings and in stained glass if you just look out for it. And sometimes the artists do depict them in a more abstract kind of like rays of light rather than like looking like physical animal type horns. But yeah, it's understood positively.
Is this picked up at all in Rabbinic Judaism, or is it really a Christian art thing?
It's really a Christian art thing. Yeah. But there seems to have been at some point the development of the horned mitre and its association with the Jewish priesthood, like back in antiquity, finds a connection in Jewish art also. And you can find a few examples from like the 18th and 19th century of Jewish depictions of biblical figures like Aaron, where he is in a horned mitre. So it does pass through culture, The reason that I really wanted to understand it is because we do find Caiaphas in costume in horned mitres. And people have generally thought that is part of this idea that Jews were children of the devil and that it's a deeply anti-Semitic costuming trope. And I think it can seem that way, sure, but it actually relates to this history of a side-horned mitre that just got stuck in art. And it takes on a sense of Orientalism. I think it relates to the crescent. Um, so, I mean, there's a whole history there of like Jews and Muslims being conceived of by Western Christendom as like smushed together, like just
Hmm.
one heathen enemy. And eventually in art, the mitre becomes much more crescent shaped rather than like an explicitly obvious mitre. And so I think we are seeing is the merging together of two different things happening: the artistic tradition around the mitre and Christian Orientalism.
So it's my understanding that the horned mitre is used in portrayals of Old Testament figures too, right? So like Aaron, the brother of Moses.
Yeah, so we find both forms of the mitre, both when it's like in the side position, that lateral first position, and in the front back position, to link the the Latin Church to back through like an ancient lineage that goes all the way back to Aaron as the very first priest. And so we will see often, I think I've mentioned already that by the time the mitre turns 90 degrees to sit front and back, the older form of the mitre is understood as older. And so Christian artists will represent figures from church history in the older form if those figures were like in the past. So it becomes a simple way of signifying that the image that you're looking at, the person in that image is a historic person. Um, there were all sorts of different techniques that medieval artists and writers had to indicate passage of time. If they didn't know what somebody wore, they would use things that were slightly outdated fashion, and that was understood as a way to historicize an image. So the mitre becomes a really easy visual shorthand to do that, to position somebody as being from the past, but also to continue to demonstrate a link with the church. So we get pictures of Aaron in the side horned mitre and other priests from the Old Testament. Um, and then you can see in Christian writing an understanding of this link, that they are actually saying, we understand that this older form is older, that we have this unbroken chain of succession, unbroken chain of authority back to the Bible. And they start to understand also the two horns themselves as signifying knowledge of the law. And
Hmm.
so this especially becomes dominant once the mitre is turned. So there's one horn at the front and one at the back. And you start to see in some writings, such as William Durandus, who was writing in the 13th century, he talks about the horn at the back as the old law and the horn at the front as the new law.
Hmm.
And so we're even seeing this sort of supersessionism in the understanding of the mitre and the horns of the mitre. But this sense of like arming the bishop with knowledge of the two testaments. And so in images of the Old Testament priesthood, including Aaron, we are seeing that link with knowledge of God's law and the horns of the mitre. And then that
Yeah.
just transfers forward.
And you have this quote from Pope Innocent III where he literally says the mitre signifies the knowledge of both testaments, for the two horns are the two testaments. So one horn
Yep,
being the Old Testament and then the other one being the New Testament.
that's right.
Hmm.
I think because the side horn mitre becomes this way of historicizing a figure, and we start to see it in representations of the Old Testament priesthood as a way of saying, hey, here were these sort of proto-Christians, these figures that they predate Christ, but they would have been Christian if they came after Christ. They're still important to our history and to our legacy and our lineage. The side horn mitre becomes attached with that as in the iconographic tradition as a known and understandable motif. And because of that, we also start to see it sometimes on Caiaphas and Annas, because they are understood as part of the Jewish priesthood. So they too would have worn the side horn mitre. And it's just through that linkage that over time, the positive connection with the church starts to fizzle out. And instead we get I think a new kind of meaning that starts to be understood as this hat being somehow associated with the old law, the old priesthood, the Jewish priesthood, and it just becomes a feature of Caiaphas and Annas's representation. And you can see them in lots of different ways, but this is just one motif that sticks. Yeah.
So the side horned mitre becoming more uh, interpreted negatively, you mean, while the 90-degree one continues as like this symbol of prestige.
Yeah. There's a weird thing too, because that I haven't been able to find an answer to, but I'm interested in it. So I'll put it out there. Maybe somebody knows. But in the actual description of what the priesthood is supposed to wear that you have in Exodus, the high priest is supposed to wear a headdress, and on the front of the headdress should be a gold plate, and that is attached to the headdress. When William Durandus was writing in the 13th century and he was explaining the garments that the bishop wears, and he says they have come from the old law, but they're slightly different from the old law. And then he has a section where he explains the garments of the old law. And there he talks about the headdress that the high priest wears. And he says that the gold plate at the front is in the shape of a half moon. And I have no idea where this comes from, but I'm assuming he means a crescent shape. And then Nicholas Lahr, who was an artist, I think he was slightly after, I mean, overlaps with Durandus in time frame. He tries to reconstruct the garments of the high priest, and he illustrates Aaron as best as he can work out from doing the research that he could at the time. And in his depiction of Aaron, he depicts him with not the side horned mitre, just some sort of headdress and a crescent moon at the front. And we start to see in art depictions sometimes of like some kind of fancy hat with a crescent moon at the front, and sometimes the side horned mitre with the crescent moon attached to the front of the side horned mitre. So there starts to be this link, I think, between the side horned mitre and the crescent moon shape. And I have no idea where Durandus gets this idea from, but it becomes a mainstay in Christian art, like over time. Yeah, there's some link there. That's mysterious, but
I wonder if that plays into the Orientalism thing too, because you mentioned the crescent moon might be.
Yeah, I think it's definitely it definitely plays into Orientalism. And you can also see a lot of representations of the temple. So the temple that was once standing in Jerusalem, that gets represented in a lot of scenes in Christian art because the temple featured in Jesus's life. So presentation of in the temple, or later on during the Passion narrative, and the Dome of the Rock substitutes the temple in a lot of Christian art. And I think the first example of that substitution, including the crescent on the top, is in the 13th century. And then you start to find this as well, too, that we have the temple in Jerusalem, the first century temple in Jerusalem being painted by Christian artists to look sort of like the Dome of the Rock and with a crescent at the top. So at some point, the crescent becomes mixed in with what's happening with the mitre and all of that imagery. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting overlap going on. But as best as we can tell, the bishop's mitre itself comes from this positive place, this understanding of Moses, this understanding of glorification of God. It takes on this link with knowledge of the law. It has a bit of supersessionism in it when it's turned 90 degrees and the new law is now triumphant in the front and the old law is at the back. But in artistic representation, it also merges with this Orientalism, with the crescent and Islam, and kind of goes off into its own kind of pejorative direction, and still lingers today in some art and some costuming traditions. Yeah.
So what you're saying, it was not inspired by a fish or a crocodile.
It was not inspired by a fish or a crocodile. No. Sorry.
Great. Well, Dr. Katie Turner, thank you so much for joining us.
You're so welcome.